Okay, so hello and welcome to this virtual presentation of consciousness and the Tribunal of Experience. This is a talk that I'm going to be giving on Monday, March 22nd at Columbia University at their Cognitive Lunch speaker series, and this is a rehearsal, a run-through of it. So let's go ahead and get started then. So consciousness has been studied a lot by science and philosophers in the last 10 to 15 years, and one thing that's come out is that there are a lot of senses of consciousness. And so before we begin to talk about what science has taught us or what we can learn from science about consciousness, we might want to distinguish various concepts of consciousness. So one thing that's obvious is there's a difference between being awake and being asleep. So David Rosenthal famously coined the term creature consciousness, and so a creature consciousness is just a property that a creature has of being awake and responding to stimuli. Now you can distinguish from that what Rosenthal called transitive consciousness. So transitive consciousness is always consciousness of something. So you're aware of the table, you're conscious of the blue color of the picture, etc. Now, added to this mix, we can distinguish what we call state consciousness. So mental states can be conscious or unconscious. And so this is what Freud's point was, that beliefs and desires can be unconscious. But we've also even discovered that sensory perceptions can be conscious or unconscious, as in the case of subliminal perception. So you see something unconsciously. The state itself is not conscious. So state consciousness, property of states; transitive consciousness, consciousness of something; creature consciousness, simply the property of being awake and responsive to stimuli. Now there's one more that we haven't talked about, and that's what we call phenomenal consciousness. So it's captured by Thomas Nagel's famous phrase, what it's like for the subject to have the experience. So here on the screen you see sort of a lavenderish purplish color and also a yellow color. And these two colors look different. So when we talk about phenomenal consciousness, we're simply talking about the way things are for you from your point of view, the difference between these things. So now we have these four different notions, and they're all interconnected. And what I'm going to be claiming is that we have a pretty good shot at giving a naturalistic account, and so we can sort of start summarizing some of the results. So when we talk about creature consciousness, I want to first talk about Alan Hobson's view, because I think that we've got a pretty good handle on what creature consciousness is. So there's Alan Hobson there. So here's a quote from a recent paper of theirs. They say of Kahn, Pay, Scott, and Hobson. So he says, look, in the awake state, the brain is aminergic, which means it's using these neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine, serotonin, and it's also cholinergic, which means it uses acetylcholine. So now when you're sleeping in the REM state, when you're dreaming, it's only cholinergic, so you don't see any of the norepinephrine, serotonin. Now, in NREM sleep, the milieu is intermediate between the two. And what this does then is it gives us a way to quantify states of creature consciousness in respect of three parameters that he calls A, I, and M. So he calls this the AIM model. So A is the activation as measured by global EEG, so it's familiar, commonplace, that if you have your eyes open, you get one pattern of scalp EEG. If you close your eyes, you get another pattern of scalp EEG, and if you do some mental task, the pattern again changes. So that gives us some information. Now I stands for input-output gating. You can measure that by sort of looking at the excitability of of spinal neurons. And the input-output gating is important, of course, because when it's obvious that when you're dreaming, you don't have the normal inputs and outputs from the sensory system. So you might be dreaming of running, but your legs aren't moving. Now, of course, what we've shown is if you sever certain spinal neurons, you can get the running motions in sleeping cats, for instance. So this gives us some information. And then M is the neuromodulatory effects, and you can measure those by brainstem aminergic neurons. And what this is doing is controlling the balance of aminergic and cholinergic receptors in the brain. So now these three things together map out a state space where you can see creatures being awake, responding to stimulus. You can see them asleep, responding to stimulus. That's when you're sleepwalking. And you can see hypnagogic reverie might be a state where you're, excuse me, you're dreaming about volleyball, and then something. You make the little jerk maneuver like you're actually hitting the volleyball, and that would be, of course, you could predict these, and that's what they do in their papers. They go through the various ways that this space could be filled out. And now I don't want to say that this is definitive or that we know that this is true, but the kind of model that Hobson et al. Present here gives us a good handle on what we mean by creature consciousness. It's nothing philosophically problematic. It's more a matter of details. Okay, so what about state consciousness? I'm going to talk briefly about fMRIs. So what about transitive consciousness? I don't know why I said state consciousness. So when we talk about transitive consciousness, remember, we're talking about being conscious of things in our environment. So you might think, well, what you do is you take some fMRIs and you see where there's activity in the brain, and then you know how we're transitively conscious of things, since when you're conscious of a face, there's activity in the fusiform facial area. So there you go. Being conscious of a face is having activity in the fusiform facial area. But that's not quite right. fMRIs can't give us pictures of brain states. What they show us is just where there is activity as measured by how many resources are being diverted there. So consider an analogy. Ancient Greeks knew that heat was correlated with life. In fact, they often, some of them were inclined to identify heat as the essence or principle of the soul, with the animating features of living organisms. So Democritus famously thought that the soul was composed of fire atoms, and you could see why, because heat is closely associated with life. When a person or an animal dies, the body gets cold. Now, of course, 2,500 years later, we can see that there's a mechanism that's responsible for this. Looking more closely has revealed metabolic mechanisms involving the breakdown of food and cellular work and so on. So converting into sugars and for fuel, and the byproduct is heat. So it is similar with the case of fMRI. You have activity in a certain area. What you want to do is examine what's going on in there until you can find the mechanism. So the question then, when we're talking about transitive consciousness, is what are the mechanisms that the brain uses to represent objects in the environment and make those available to the areas of the brain which have to perform the computations which are necessary for the many, many tasks that we perform. Now, I think we can begin to give an answer to this, and in fact, I've argued in a paper of mine that we've sort of discovered what the essential characteristic here. It's synchronous neural activity in specific populations of neurons. So, of course, this all harks back to Hebb, famously the idea of a cell assembly, and Wolf Singer here has been one of the leading proponents of this idea. So he argues that the binding problem in the brain can be solved by synchrony. So how do you get neurons that are responding to various features of an object to all represent the same thing? Well, how the brain does that by synchrony. So he's shown very convincing, in my mind, evidence that synchrony is the mechanism for neural representation. And it turns out that synchrony might just be a general strategy utilized by the brain. So there's Georgi Buzaki there from Rutgers. And he's done work on memory. He's a leading figure in the electrophysiology of the hippocampus. And what he's been able to show in a convincing body of work is that these various frequencies have functions. So you get theta waves, you get gamma waves, you get what are called sharp waves and spindles. And each one of these plays in a distinctive frequency, and each one of these plays an interesting role in memory formation. So the basic idea he has is that when the animal is out and about, walking around, it's having percepts and taking in information about its environment. When the animal has a period of rest, that information is transmitted to the cortex for long-term storage. And he's even able to show us, but sort of it goes in reverse order and sort of gets consolidated. And more recently, we see people like Edvard Moser, who he is here. He's a bit of a younger guy, but he's actually, very, very recent page. His lab has been doing very interesting work showing in the hippocampus that in the gamma range, there's a broad range of frequencies from something like 40 hertz up to in the hundreds, depending on how you divide the frequencies up. But a wide range of frequency, and people have sort of wondered what their purpose is, and Edvard Moser suggested that perhaps each one of these frequencies is a different station, so to speak. And if you use an analogy, a station much like a TV station or a radio station, and they're broadcasting information. So you get one station that's broadcasting memories, another station that's broadcasting actual percepts, and various neurons can tune into those frequencies and get the data that's being carried in other waveforms. So he's been able to suggestively show that you can distinguish the carrier wave from the signal wave. And that fits very nicely with what Bujaki has done. For instance, Bujaki has shown in the gamma and theta that they're very closely synchronized. And so theta serves as the carrier wave, and gamma is serving as the information coding for the information. And then you get that being broadcast from the hippocampus to the cortex by the mechanism of entraining cells in the cortex to the carrier wave frequency, to theta, in other words, and then it's able to make sense of the to decode the information. So that's very suggestive. Now, again, this isn't established, and there are critics, but I think that we have a viable theory here, and we can at least see that there aren't any philosophical hurdles in a theory of transitive consciousness. So now that brings us to state consciousness. Now it's at this point where we leave the level of neuroscience and ascend up to the level of cognitive psychology, because when you're trying to give a theory of what a mental state is when it's conscious, what you're doing here is asking what is the difference between subliminally perceiving something and superliminally perceiving it. One is conscious, the other one is not. The subliminal perception has all of the causal influences and mechanisms that the conscious one does. In fact, I was recently just reading a paper which showed that, or strongly suggested that commercials that are unconsciously perceived, so they're on the background that you're not conscious of them, that they're more effective than ones that you're conscious of or that are consciously paying attention to. So the unconscious states have strong causal connections and so on. So now there are basically two theories of this kind of stuff. So you distinguish between what we call a first order theory and a higher order theory. So the first order theories claim that conscious mental states are ones that you're conscious with. So when you're seeing an apple, you have a mental state that represents that there's an apple there, and that's what a conscious mental state is. It's representing the features of the objects out there. Now the problem with this from the higher order view is it seems to make every mental state a conscious mental state, and we seem to lose the distinction between conscious and unconscious mental states. Which leads us to the higher order view. Now on a higher order view, conscious states are states that I am conscious of myself as having. So if I have a belief that George Bush is the worst president in the history of the United States, that can be an unconscious belief, and it may be influencing me in various ways. But of course I can have that belief consciously, and when I do, I'm aware of myself as believing that. So I'm conscious of the belief itself, and then the belief is a conscious belief. So we have these two various theories, and interestingly, some empirical work has been brought to bear here. And so I want to take one look at an argument, which is supposed to be an argument in favor of the first order view, and it's going to be a good primer for us because we're going to come back to this when I want to look at a more recent argument. This one's a few years old. I want to look at a more recent one. This one will help us. So here's a figure from a paper by Fernandez, Duque, and Thornton, and what they're trying to show is that you can detect that something has changed even if you don't consciously detect that thing has changed. So here in figure A, you see the experimental design. So you're presented with these rectangles arranged in a clock-like formation around a central fixation point, and then you're presented that, and then a mask, and then another one where they're exactly the same except for one of the rectangles has changed its orientation. So I've just labeled those George and not George. It'll be convenient for us to do that. So George is the horizontal one, not George is the vertical one. So you present them that, each one 250 milliseconds, first scene, mask 250 milliseconds, second scene. Then you present them with C, where not George is highlighted, and you say, did this rectangle change its orientation? Subjects can't tell. They don't know. They're not aware of it. Well, in fact, they're wrong. It has changed. So this is sort of your classic change blindness scenario. Now, the interesting thing that is in figure B, if you say you highlight both of these diagonal ones and say, well, if you had to guess, if you were told one of these two changed, which one would you pick? Well, subjects pick not George, which seems to suggest that they have the information there. We're going to come back to that later, but right now let's just focus on figure C. So Fred Dretske famously argued that this change blindness result poses a problem for higher order views. So he says, look, he reasons as follows. Subjects are presented with C, the figure in C, and they have time to observe it. They're conscious of every part of the there's plenty of time for them to observe it, so they have a conscious experience of all of the rectangles, but they're not conscious of the difference. So they have a conscious experience, the experience of all the rectangles, and but they're not conscious of this experience, and so therefore higher order views have a problem. Now, David Rosenthal has responded to this in various places, and what he says is that there's a problem here. The argument doesn't show what it's alleged to show, because one can have a conscious experience of not George, even though one's higher order awareness doesn't represent not George as the difference. So you have a conscious experience of the rectangle in a certain orientation. You have a conscious experience of not George. You have a conscious experience of George, right, the previous one, but you're not conscious of not George in the respect of it being the difference between the two figures. Therefore, it will seem to you that there is no difference between the two scenes. So we can sort of explain what's going on here, but it's not the case that there's a conscious experience that you are not conscious of. So there's nothing that falsifies or threatens higher order theories in change blindness. Okay, so now, so there's nothing that threatens higher order theories in change blindness. So at this point, the higher order theory is a very powerful theory. It's something that's clearly going to be consistent with common sense and with scientific evidence. And the first sort of representationalism is not very popular amongst scientists. In fact, Ned Block in his recent paper comparing the major theories of consciousness, doesn't even talk about representationalism, because it's not something that neuroscientists really take seriously. So now, what about phenomenal consciousness? That's, of course, the big problem. But according to the higher order theory, if it's right, one of its main big virtues is that it's going to allow us an explanation of what phenomenal consciousness is, and in such a way that we can see a straightforwardly naturalistic accounting for phenomenal consciousness. So according to the higher order theory, for me to have a conscious pain is just for me to be conscious of myself as being in pain. So here I am. Now suppose I have this pain. This is a mental state here, and that says pain star there to represent that it's different from the pain property that I'm sensing. So If, for instance, you've stabbed my leg with a knife, there's going to be tissue damage, and nociceptors are going to be sending me a signal, and that's the thing that I'm sensing, the damage there. And the pain star then is going to be the state that in my mental life has the causal connections associated with that kind of pain. So it's going to cause wincing and screaming and running around and so on. But if the pain, like all mental states, can occur consciously or unconsciously, then we need to explain what it is for it to be conscious. Now, according to Rosenthal and according to the higher order view, when the pain is unconscious, it's not painful for you, even though it may have certain causal connections. You won't experience it as painful until you have the higher order awareness of it, in Rosenthal's case of thought. Now, of course, in the case of pains, they usually directly cause their higher order thoughts, so it's rarely the case that pains are unconscious in this way, but it does happen occasionally. You have a headache through the course of the day you're not aware of at some points. You might be thinking about something else, and then suddenly you notice the headache again. You go, oh, there's that headache. And it seems like it's the same headache. It's just that at one point you weren't aware of it. You weren't conscious of it. Okay, so now that's nice, as I said previously, because it's going to give us this naturalistic reductive account. And if transitive consciousness can be straightforwardly explained in terms of neural synchrony, then it's going to turn out that we can give a non-mysterious account of phenomenal properties, because my having a conscious pain, it just turns out to be my being transitively conscious of myself as being in a certain state. Okay, so there are alleged problems for this, and Ned Block has been one recent vocal opponent of the higher order theory. So here's a similar kind of experiment similar to Fernandez-Duque et al., which I mentioned earlier. This is the one that Ned Block actually talks about. So you have your three conditions here, basically getting at what was in figure B in the other graph. So in the first condition, it's just the one we were familiar with. You present George and not George. They cue them. They say, what about this one over here? This change. People say no. Okay. So now, of course, in the second one, they cue people where they're going to pick. And people are very good at this. They recognize the change. Of course, they were attending right there. So, of course, they recognize the change. Now, the interesting condition is C here, and this is analogous to the other one. So instead of cueing them at the first one, they cue them during the mask, and then people are, of course, still very good at determining which one changed, even though here they don't have a representation. There's nothing there, so which seems to imply that they had a representation of the experience. And of course, in the Fernandez-Duque thing, it's the same. You highlight both of them, say which one changed. They're able to access that information, so they're having some kind of, if they need to access it, they can. So something is there which they can access. So now Block has argued that there's a problem here for higher order theory. So here's what he says from his recent paper about the mesh between neuroscience and psychology, presenting what he calls the phenomenological overflow problem. So he says the subject has persisting experiences as of more specific shapes than can be brought under the concept required to report or compare those specific shapes with others. They can all be brought under the concept rectangle, but not the specific orientation concepts which would be required to make the comparisons. Now, what exactly is supposed to be the problem here? Well, the subjects are reporting that they have an experience. They're saying, well, gee, I see a bunch of shapes. I just don't know if this one is different or not. So they're not able to bring these specific concepts to bear. But they report having an experience of all the shapes, and we should believe them because they've been looking at this stuff uninterruptedly. So if they have experiences that they can't report, their not being able to report is evidence that they don't have the relevant higher order awareness, the higher order thoughts. And David Rosenthal does admit, and in fact he thinks it's a point in his favor oftentimes, uses it as an argument for the higher order thought theory, that you're always able to report conscious states that you're in. So if that's the case, well, it seems like these kinds of results, Block says, suggest a counterexample to the higher order thought theory, namely, there's a conscious experience that you don't have the higher order thought, you're not conscious of. Now, Stanislaw Dehaene has responded to this in a series of papers, and Block talks about this in his Mesh article again. He jokingly refers to it as the refrigerator light fallacy. So, what's the refrigerator light illusion? Well, you might think that the refrigerator light is always on simply because every time you check it, it is on. So, every time you open the refrigerator, the light's on. You might think, yeah, then it's on all the time. Well, of course, there's a mistake there. You can't be sure that it's on all the time. When it's closed, in fact, we know it's only potentially on. It's not actually on. So it's a mistake to think that something that's potentially the case is actually the case. And Dehaene uses this to respond to Ned's challenge. So he says subjects think that phenomenal states are always on simply because they are when they check. And the basic idea that Dehaene has is that subjects are under a kind of an illusion in this case, where they think they can access this stuff. And so they think they have a conscious experience. They're saying, I see all of the rectangles, but they consciously don't. They erroneously take their ability to access that information if they wanted to it actually being phenomenologically there. Now, Bloch's response is just that the hypothesis that they're phenomenally conscious states that we're not aware of better explains the subject's reports. I mean, remember, they're saying we see all of the rectangles, and generally we take subjects at face value, and there's no real reason to think that they're under some kind of an illusion. And Bloch spends time in the paper arguing that there's nothing like a normal illusion going on here, at least. So if there's an illusion, it's a weird illusion. And you notice that it would be a very strange illusion because these people are saying, no, I have an experience of all of these rectangles. And the Dehaene says, no, you don't. You just think that you have an experience of all the rectangles. You're really wrong about that. What you really have an experience of is well, not all the rectangles, one of them or something like that. You could access information about the other rectangles, but you don't have the experience of that. Well, I think that this is wrong, and it certainly isn't. It certainly isn't something you want to say, that they're having this kind of an illusion, that they think they're having an experience that they're not having. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But of course, there's not a problem here for the higher order thought theory, and that's why it was important for us to go through the Dretske material earlier, because the kind of response that the higher order theorists can give is exactly the response that Dretske got from Rosenthal oh so many years ago when this debate first started. And Bloch himself admits that the subjects are able to bring the concept rectangle to bear on their experience. Once you do that, the answer is pretty obvious. So what's going on? Well, you have a first order state. In the first order state, you can be conscious of in various respects. That was the lesson from change blindness to begin with. You're conscious of all the shapes, but not conscious of the shape in the respect of its being the thing that makes the difference. So here you're conscious of all of the rectangles, but not in respect of their specific orientations. So there's no illusion. They're reporting the experience that they're actually having. They're conscious of a bunch of rectangles. Now, of course, that they can get the information that they want if they're cued just shows that they have an unconscious representation of the material there. It doesn't show that the unconscious representations are phenomenological, because so far we haven't found anything that is overflowing. We found that the higher order thought theory says that they have exactly the conscious experience that they're reporting. So again, just to sort of summarize and finalize this, there's me again. Suppose that I'm having this experience. I'm looking at the figure from the Landman et al. or from Sperling or whatever your favorite experiment is, and I report, well, I see a bunch of rectangles, but I can't really say whether this one is the same as that one or not. Now, what according to the higher order theorist is going on in my experience? Well, I have a first order representation That's very detailed. That's sort of what the Fernandez-Duque and the Landman and Sperling kinds of experiments all demonstrate, is that, or one plausible interpretation is that what they demonstrate is that we have very detailed representations of the visual scenes, even if we don't have conscious representations of the scenes. Now, of course, I am having a conscious experience, and it's the experience of having a bunch of rectangles arranged in a clock face like formation. So the higher order thought, which determines what it's like for me, simply specifies some of the properties of the first order state, but not all of it. And that's exactly what I report. So there is no problem for the higher order theory. And again, we have our hopes can be kept alive that we can give a satisfying account of consciousness in naturalistic terms. And now, on the other hand, Bloch's argument that you can solve the methodological puzzle by looking at which theory gives you better explanations overall of subject reports and the mesh between all the scientific data. What this shows is that the higher order theory meshes with all the data just as well as any other theory of consciousness, maybe not the first order theory. So we haven't really found any reason to prefer first order theories over higher order theories. Okay, thank